My background, interestingly, is not ISO 50001 nor energy efficiency. It's actually banking, finance and aircraft leasing, just to come clean. So I wanted to do something just to explain why I'm here that had purpose. And I thought that maybe we could use the principles that have made aircraft leasing so successful, really renting, not buying, to encourage greater investment in energy efficiency. And if you think about it, companies like Ryanair have been able to grow so fast and strong by renting and not buying. It really allows them to punch stronger than their capital budgets allow. And I wonder, could we get some extra momentum in energy efficiency over and above the capital the businesses have available? So on to then what Vivid Edge is doing. So essentially, we're helping organizations meet climate action targets without spending their money, and delivering energy efficiency upgrades as a service. So more on that later. I will at this point, though, reassure you that we do have energy efficiency expertise in the business. And that's my partner and Vivid Edge's technical director, Paul Boylan, who I know some of you will know well. So he leads that part of our work. And all as well. So why are we here? Vivid Edge really see ourselves as ISO 50001 enablers, and we can support both the energy professionals and the energy users on both embarking on a journey and also continuing on that journey as continuous improvements come into play. So, with our service model, really we can make ISO 50001 that bit more affordable, spreading the cost over many years. We can enable a kind of a long-term way of thinking. Sometimes the cheapest technology gets chosen when capital budgets are tight, but that isn't always the economically most viable choice in the longer one when you consider longevity, maintenance costs. So it really allows much more comprehensive and longer term planning, which we know is very consistent with the spirit of what ISO 50001 is trying to achieve. And then also, we can enable measures that don't impact cash flow. So that's really why we're here. Today, I want to briefly reference climate change, and the two core topics I want to cover are funding models, which is what I know a little bit about, and our offering in that context, and then also just some insights on what we have learned trying to mobilize projects and some thoughts on how we can get the industry moving at a faster pace. Now, I want to share this with you. And it's already started on me. Just a second, how do I stop that? There we go. So what this is from NASA, and it tracks, some of you will have seen it. I find it fascinating, and it really is just to remind us why we do what we do. I know I'm talking to the converted with some real pioneers in the room long before I got involved in this space, but this is interesting. Tracks the energy, the average climate increase in degrees across the different countries of the world over the last 140 years. I would like you to look out for two things. Just observe Ireland here in the pink on the left-hand side. And also just look at what date on the top of the screen the really huge climate increase actually started. So we're in the early 1900s. The red is a 2-degree increase. The orange is a 1-degree increase. The blue is a decrease. So here we are in 1950s, still very much kind of blues and oranges. 1960s, 1970s, a few pockets of red coming and going. We're into the early 1990s now, and now it's suddenly starting to go, really red. Now, what really struck me about this was the conversation I normally have is I talk about the last 100 years, and that's the conversation I hear. It's the last 30. The trajectory in that last 30 years is staggering, and that's the trajectory we're on. And I know I don't need to convince anybody here, but sometimes it's nice to share an infographic that just sort of confirms how compelling what we're all doing actually is. So with that, I'm going to move on to funding models. Apologies, I've unshared my slides. Go back in here. So there are a number of different funding models. I'll just see if I can minimize here the screens. So one really important point I want to bring across, the International Energy Agency says that 5 times the amount of current global investment is needed to achieve energy efficiency targets. That's more than an extra $1 trillion invested annually globally. And really what that's saying is that no matter how much we do developing new technologies, and that's an important part of it, if we don't have emerging and innovative funding models alongside that, we're actually not going to get there. So we actually do have to think more creatively to get there. And that's where Vivid Edge comes in. The second thing I want to emphasize is I'm not promoting any one of these over the other. On the contrary, we need every single one of these models and more potentially to get to where we need to get to. And they all play their important part. And certainly when Vivid Edge came into this space, our aspiration was to really help mobilize more projects and some of the ones that weren't currently, as viable in traditional funding models, and really just give organizations a tool to have a smarter use of their capital. So we have here on the slide, we've got cash, in debt going across to supplier finance into energy performance contracts. Now, what I will say is as you move from left to right, you're probably moving from the cheapest to the most expensive, but you're not necessarily comparing apples with apples because you've got a completely different sort of risk dimension in these different funding products and a completely different value add. So they're not comparable, but each of them plays a part. Cash is obviously the best place to start, but as we all know, a company, and if you have surplus cash, it makes sense to use that for the energy efficiency upgrade. But any good CFO will know, and I used to be one, that we need to hold enough cash reserves to see the business through uncharted waters. And we've seen what COVID has done and how those businesses who has enough cash are surviving. And you could add climate as an equal threat in the mix. What kind of climate events are there going to be that are going to challenge companies' cash flows? So if you're a company, maybe you've sold a division and you've got serious surplus cash. I'm not saying to eat into your reserves. If there's genuinely surplus cash, best place to start. Next cheapest and next place to start is bank debt. And I know large multinationals can typically get that for a price of low single digit interest rate, getting up to higher single digits as you're getting into SMEs. And again, that's a super kind of cost effective way to fund a project. Again, that needs to be balanced with the business's needs because, again, as the finance people know, as you pile debt onto a company's balance sheet, you're weakening the strength of that balance sheet. And the business needs a strong balance sheet to grow and to make strategic investments. So, a lot of businesses want to, use capital for their core business. A hospital might want to invest in medical equipment, before they might want to put in new air conditioning systems. So, good businesses will manage the total amount of debt in their balance sheet, and there isn't an unlimited pool there, but it's certainly a source to be considered. And then you get into lease and supplier finance, and I do come from a leasing background. Leasing is a product, and typically you've seen it used aircraft, cranes, wheels finance, equipment finance. It's a little bit more challenging when it comes into energy efficiency projects because it's hard to get 100% finance when you have all of the ancillary costs involved. You might need engineering works, design fees. It's much more like project finance really, and it's hard to get everything covered. So the lease equipment lease providers don't always have an appetite for this asset class, and that really I believe has been what has caused the emergence of a really strong market in supplier finance in the lighting space really. And you will all have seen lighting as a service now prominently in the market, and that's where the supplier will provide finance for their own products under a service model. They'll charge a monthly fee over a few years, no upfront payment. So that has played a really important role and has helped on this transition, and I expect it to continue to play a really important role. One caveat though, nasty new accounting standards came in 2018, and they made it much more difficult for people to implement a service contract like lighting as a service and to still account for it as off balance sheet. In other words, to still avoid reflecting some degree of balance sheet debt, recognizing the future commitment. So that has put a slight sting in the tail, but it's still a great product and it still helps with cash flow. Then you get into Vivid Edge's model, and we started off with a sort of a more traditional service contract, and we very much morphed that into a slightly different product. It's still a service model. It's still really simple in terms of what the customer sees, but we have devised a confirmed off-balance sheet structure, which means that our model is definitely treatable as operating expenditure, just a monthly fee. So it means the energy savings can cover that fee, and it can be a self-funding model. So really a nice way to boost the other capital sources that are available, to do more and do sooner. And the other thing that we're seeing is that projects that may not have been viable, maybe because of a company's payback rules, if the project doesn't pay back in 3 years, sometimes it doesn't get picked. The longer term projects become viable with our model because we can spread over a longer term, and we're not tied to a manufacturer. So, you can bundle different measures together from different suppliers. That's kind of how we work. One other way we work, and really the market is only beginning to move in this direction, but we really encourage a comprehensive program of spend, so we can work with a group's program office for a whole program of spend across different locations, while allowing complete local supplier choice. So you can have different suppliers in different locations and different technologies. So really trying to encourage people to think deeper and more comprehensive. And then the energy performance contract, again, to reiterate, we see that as important and here to stay. It is different to our model in a few ways. We've really stripped some of the complexity out of that. I'll give you just one example. They're typically shared savings models, and shared savings models requires the supplier, so us potentially, or other provider, to guarantee not just the performance of the equipment, but how the customer chooses to use the asset. That ends up being very expensive because that's something that the supplier is not actually controlling. So we really believe that the savings should all stay with the customer. They're motivated then to save as much as they can. And then this also means they're not being charged for another party guaranteeing something they don't control. But there are certain circumstances where the shared savings model is attractive and works. And I see that still very much on the table. We're just a simpler and perhaps more cost-effective alternative. So that's just a very, very quick whistle-stop tour. What the service model looks like. So this will work for us and for lighting as a service in terms of cash flows. That looks like this graph is a typical energy cost graph. You've got increasing costs of carbon and potentially increasing cost of energy, carbon taxes, and increasing consumption, and particularly as inefficiencies come into play. And then with our model like ours, at the beginning here where the cursor is, that's the blue is the baseline. We pay for everything, no customer outlay until the energy savings kick in. When they do kick in, they use some of those savings to pay us a monthly fee. We really hope there's upside. We try and achieve that by spreading the cost. And then at the end of the project, the customer can take control of the asset and enjoy it for its remaining useful life. So really, it is a very much a self-funding project. And I'll caveat by saying it does depend, of course, on the baseline. And you guys in the room will understand that. So now touching up to what we have learned, we've seen, I think, a seismic shift since we got started. And, when we founded Vivid Edge, really the importance of climate was not understood. And so much has changed. And we're now seeing climate as a key strategic pillar in organizations. We're seeing the appointment of a new CCO role, the Chief Climate Officer. That's really encouraging. And we're seeing businesses committing to very ambitious targets without necessarily knowing how they're going to get there. And we love that. That's an entrepreneurial way of thinking. And really, the ISO 50001 professionals are a key part of helping bridge that gap. And Vivid Edge also is a part of helping organizations bridge that gap between these increasingly ambitious targets and just sort of the current operational readiness on the ground. On the other hand, we still think there's some way to go, and we're very much seeing a disconnect between the strategic intent and the operational readiness on the ground. And we'll give you a few examples. Certainly, like we've seen organizations where a CEO was really keen for us to do a project, but when we engaged with the energy manager or the property manager, he said that he'd already met his targets for the current year. I think Ian Boylan referred to kind of this idea of kind of banking projects for future years. We also think this is an awful shame. He wanted to keep something in the bag for his own goals, not really for the company, for future years. He didn't want to overperform too soon. So like a tragedy there of goals not aligned. This project, incidentally, was self-funding. We had a grant and also a 0% finance. Unusually, it was a no-brainer, but it didn't go ahead because the energy manager's goals and reward system wasn't aligned with the group strategic intent. And we also see certain, roadblocks. So even where companies are putting in, a program office, typically, as we all know, to manage something through an organization requires the approval of different stakeholders. So you'll have, typically we see procurement working very closely with the project office and that working very effectively. But then we'll see that something needs to be improved by finance, and they're busy with, year end or month end or budgeting or whatever. And you end up just having a pause, waiting for a different function to sign it off. Then things will go into legal and you'll have the same situation. And then when things get into procurement, they'll go through various hoops. They'll go through local procurement, and then they can be fully signed off at the local level, and then they go back into group procurement. And we had one interesting project where really, when group got involved to look at an already agreed project, they shaved a minor additional amount of the price, which took them 8 months, and it cost them 20 times their saving in lost energy. So I think what we'd really just encourage is companies to really look. I think a lot of companies are getting in their own way with some of the structures and steps that need to be gone through to get to energy efficiency projects. And I think they could look at a shorter route to approving and mobilising, and really ring fencing some dedicated resource that's multifunctional to really help that happen. The other thing we're seeing traditionally is a project rather than a program-based approach. And really what is needed is we design, so much more is possible, and you can make much more longer term thinking when you actually embark on a whole rolling program of spend rather than just individual project by project. And then also we've seen less viable opportunities when we go into businesses have just been disconsidered, and we would say, look, put them back on the list. So much more is possible with different models. Finally, grants and supports, just two observations there. We're seeing projects getting hugely delayed waiting for grant approval. We believe that a project should be eligible for grant approval. We would sort of challenge the authorities to consider this once an application has gone in. It's an awful shame to have to wait and not start planning and commencing the project. You're effectively just delaying progress for potentially 6 months. And secondly, supports. It's widely acknowledged there isn't enough capital to achieve climate action targets, but companies are not eligible for a grant if they choose to fund it with a third-party funder. And that's an awful shame, because the outcome is that the projects simply don't happen. We believe that capital and capital efficiency should be a company's own concern, and that grants, such as the SEAI grant, should become available irrespective of how the company chooses to fund it, once the other key criteria are met. So we think all of these different things are causing a slowdown in pace. And then very quickly, then for better pace, what do we think is needed? We think the right internal model with a dedicated team and aligned priorities right through the organisation. We're really seeing, we saw one very clever supplier who has a multi-location contract to deliver energy efficiency projects. And in their contract, they're getting paid irrespective of whether the subsidiary actually implements the project or not, once they come up with a good project and the subsidiary gets charged. I think it's really important to think through what is motivating throughout the organisation, and not just having something at the top and then something very different happening on the ground. We really do welcome a rolling program of spend, really a really big role for the energy advisors, we believe, and putting everything back on the table and exploring new models. I've talked about the need to remove disincentives and delays in grants and supports, and really we have to embrace new delivery models. We won't get there without them. So it really is about moving the things that are slowing us down moving the roadblocks, thinking more strategically, appointing people to deliver, 3 years of projects, not just one. So that's really what we see as needed. Overall, though, we think that the future is very encouraging. It's fantastic to see the importance of climate finally appreciated. We need to remove the roadblocks and delays. We need to embrace new models. And if we take that approach, so much more is possible. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much indeed, Tracy. That was a really super whistle-stop tour, and you took us through a lot of the delays I think many of us are frustrated with there near the end, and I'll come back to you on that in the Q&A. But I see just a quick note here to me that you're going to be on Amazon Prime on a docu-series, I believe.
Yes, it's very interesting. One of the things I've really, really enjoyed since getting involved in this sector is just the ability to spend time with people who are making a really meaningful impact, solving some of the UN's social development goals and we're or SDGs, pardon me, we're sustainable development goals, and obviously climate is one of them. There's an Amazon Prime docu-series getting together CEOs and entrepreneurs from around the world, and it's like a reality show, but one with a purpose. I normally hesitate if somebody asks me to participate in a reality show, and at least I hope I'm understanding what it's about. But it's helping solve some of the world's biggest issues, getting people together in the room for 4 days, and just to see what can we come up with. And the backers of the show are willing to fund the mobilization of some of the ideas that some of the teams come up with. So climate is obviously one of the key ones, and the one that I'll be participating in. So it's just a joy and a privilege to be able to participate. I reiterate, I know a very small amount about this sector. I fully believe that it's absolutely probably the biggest problem facing us today. Bill Gates certainly confirms it's much bigger than COVID. So I'm thrilled to be able to play a small part and maybe just bringing a different mindset to finding solutions.
I think it's absolutely great, and I think what you said about the aircraft leasing is so applicable, and it's great to see. We've seen the climate activists getting the airtime. Now we're beginning to see the energy activists and the finance activists, if I can put it that way. So it's fantastic to see it. It's great stuff altogether.
And I'd like to just confirm that we the activists are playing an important role around awareness. We don't see ourselves as activists, but we see us as finding practical solutions to the problem. So we're probably playing in an adjacent space to the activists.
Oh, absolutely.
But really coming up with innovative new ways of doing things. But again, everyone needs to play their particular part to help make this happen.
100%. We'll come back to you with questions at the Q&A, Tracy. Thank you very much indeed.